I never thought it would happen to me. My wife, the woman I trusted with everything, was hiding a secret that would shatter my world. I noticed little things at first: extra trips, strange excuses, smiles she shouldn't have been giving, and then I discovered the truth. She was cheating, not just once, not just with anyone, with someone I never expected. My life, my family, everything I thought I had was crumbling before my eyes, but I wasn't going to let this go quietly. How far would I go to make things right? And would the consequences be more than I could handle? I always tell people that betrayal doesn't hit you in one clean moment, like a punch to the gut. It creeps in, slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the ceiling, until one day you realize the whole structure above you is rotting. Looking back now, I think I always knew something wasn't right with my wife. Not in the early days of our marriage. No, we were young then, full of hope, and caught up in the madness of raising two kids before we'd even figured out who we were as adults. But somewhere around the early 2000s, when life should have felt settled, I started noticing the cracks. At that time, my kids were 4 and 6, two little whirlwinds of energy who loved Nickelodeon cartoons, chicken nuggets, and fighting over who got the bigger scoop of ice cream. Life revolved around them, and honestly, I didn't mind. I worked long hours in sales, grinding away for a regional electronics distributor, while my wife Jenny worked part-time at a dental office. Between my job and her schedule, we were barely holding the seams together. That's marriage with young kids. Your romance takes a back seat to diapers, soccer practices, and trying to keep the lights on. We lived in suburban Ohio, not far from Columbus. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house looked like it had been built by the same architect, where neighbors waved politely while mowing the lawn, but didn't really know each other's business. I liked that. I didn't need drama in my life. I'd grown up with enough of it. My parents had cheated on each other back and forth, like it was some kind of competition, and the fallout left me and my siblings scarred in ways I didn't even understand until I became a father myself. I swore to myself I would never put my kids through that. That promise shaped everything I did. I stayed late at work to provide, but I made sure I was home in time to read bedtime stories. I volunteered for school events when I could. I thought Jenny and I were on the same page, working as a team to give our kids the stable, drama-free childhood we never had. But life has a way of reminding you that just because you're committed to something doesn't mean the other person is. It started small. The kids would come home and talk about spending the day at Grandma and Grandpa's. Jenny's parents lived about an hour and a half away, down near Chillicothe, and while it wasn't strange for them to see the kids occasionally, it started happening a lot, like multiple times a week. I remember one night, my daughter climbed onto my lap and told me about how she had gotten ice cream at the little shop near her grandparents' house that day. I smiled, because who doesn't love hearing their kid excited about sprinkles and soft serve? But then I realized, wait, wasn't Jenny supposed to have taken them to the park that afternoon? When I asked her later, she brushed it off, said she decided last minute to visit her parents. No big deal, but I knew her. She was never a good liar. She fidgeted, avoided eye contact, gave me way too many details, like she was reading from a script she hadn't memorized well enough. I wanted to trust her. I really did, but the feeling stuck in my gut like a stone. It wasn't just the trips. She started dressing differently too. Nothing drastic, but subtle enough that I noticed. She wore more makeup on her errand days, and her perfume lingered in the air when she came home in the evening. When I asked why she was getting so dressed up just to drop the kids off at her parents', she laughed it off, said she was tired of looking like a frumpy mom. I wanted to believe her. Hell, I convinced myself it was a good thing. Maybe she was just trying to feel more confident. Maybe this was her way of reclaiming a part of herself. But deep down, I knew. The thing is, suspicion eats away at you. It's not just about wondering where someone is or who they're with. It's about questioning your own sanity. Was I being paranoid because of my parents' history? Was I projecting my fears onto her? Or was I seeing the truth and just too afraid to admit it? Nights became harder. I'd lie awake listening to her breathe beside me, wondering who she was dreaming about. I hated myself for thinking that way, but the thought wouldn't leave. The turning point came one Saturday morning. I was in the garage, organizing tools, when I noticed the odometer on her car. Jenny wasn't much of a driver outside of errands and family trips, so I knew roughly what her mileage should look like. Something didn't add up. I jotted the number down on a scrap of paper and checked it again a week later. She had driven nearly 400 extra miles, miles she couldn't account for. When I asked her about it casually, she got defensive, said she'd been running around a lot with the kid, but the kids' stories never matched her timeline. That's when I stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt. I knew something was happening. I just didn't know what. Then fate handed me a gift I wasn't sure I wanted. One evening, I sat down at the family computer, one of those old beige towers with the loud fan and AOL dial-up screeching in the background, and there it was, a sticky note with her AOL password written in her handwriting. I stared at it for what felt like an hour. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew it was wrong to snoop, but I also knew that sometimes the only way to find the truth is to step over the line. So I logged in, and there it was, email after email to her college best friend, talking casually, almost gleefully, about her affair, about how she was meeting up with her high school boyfriend, about how his wife had let herself go after having kids, and how she felt so alive when she was with him. I remember the taste of bile in my throat as I read those. I printed them out, hands shaking, and shoved them into an envelope I hid in my desk. That was the moment everything changed. I thought the emails would be enough to push me into action, but the truth is, they didn't break me the way you might expect. They didn't send me storming into the bedroom to scream at Jenny or pack my bags and leave. Instead, they left me hollow, like I'd been punched so hard in the stomach that I couldn't even breathe, let alone fight back. For a few days, I carried those printed emails in my work briefcase, almost like a cursed object I couldn't let go of. Every time I glanced at that envelope, I'd feel the heat rise in my chest. It was like carrying around a ticking bomb, but I didn't detonate it, not yet, because as much as I hated myself for admitting it, I still needed more proof, more clarity, more than just Jenny's cruel words about another man's wife, or her giddy little confessions to her best friend. I needed to know exactly what she was doing, when, and with whom. That's when I called Mark, an old buddy of mine, who worked for the Columbus Police Department. Mark wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. When I told him about the emails and the mileage, he whistled low and said, "Man, you need eyes on her, not just suspicions, not just some real eyes." He gave me the number of a private investigator, Ron. I'll never forget meeting him for the first time. He was a stocky guy in his late 40s, with a worn leather jacket and a face that looked like it had seen every kind of lie a human being could tell. We met at a diner off I-70, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and waitresses who called you hon. I slid the envelope of emails across the table, like we were in some bad crime movie, half expecting him to laugh, but he did. He read them carefully, nodded and said in this gravelly voice, "Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Do you know how long that is when you're living in limbo? When you know the truth is coming, but you're forced to go about your day, pretending everything is normal." I tucked the kids into bed, mowed the lawn, paid the bills, and all the while the clock ticked louder and louder in my head. I started noticing every detail about Jenny, the way she hummed while folding laundry, the way she left her phone face down on the counter, the way she seemed almost lighter, like she was carrying some private joy I wasn't part of. It made me sick. Ron delivered right on schedule. He called me one Tuesday evening and told me to meet him again at the diner. This time, he didn't waste any time. He pulled out a manila folder, thick with photos, times, dates, and a neat typed report. My hands shook as I opened it. There she was, Jen, in her work clothes, smiling at a man I recognized immediately from high school yearbooks. Bob. He had been one of those all-American types back then. Football, prom king, the whole deal. Seeing him now, middle-aged with thinning hair and a paunch, didn't make it easier. It made it worse, because it wasn't about looks or charm. It was about history, familiarity, something I could never compete with, because I wasn't part of her past, Ron's report laid it all out in brutal detail. Jenny would drop the kids at her parents', meet Bob for lunch, then they'd check into a motel off Route 2, the kind of place where the curtains never quite close and the neon sign flickers at night. 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Then she'd drive back, pick up the kids, and act like nothing had happened. I stared at those pictures until my eyes blurred. My wife, holding hands with another man. My wife, walking into a motel room with him. My wife, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. And the worst part, she looked happy, genuinely happy. That was the knife that cut deepest. I went home that night and sat in the driveway for almost an hour, engine off, just staring at the house. The kids' bikes were tipped over in the yard. The porch light was from the outside. We looked like any other family in the neighborhood, normal, stable, but inside, everything was rotten, and I knew I couldn't unknow it. The next day I called a divorce lawyer. His name was Harold, a meticulous man, with a sharp voice, and a reputation for being ruthless in court. I told him everything, slid Ron's report across his desk and said I wanted out, fast. He didn't flinch. He'd seen it all before, but he did warn me infidelity doesn't carry the weight it used to in divorce court. It wouldn't magically give me custody or strip Jenny of her rights. Still, I didn't care. I wasn't using it as a weapon against her. I just needed it for me. Proof that I wasn't crazy. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I couldn't stop thinking about Bob. Ron had included a section in his report about him. His job as VP of sales at his father-in-law's company. His wife. His 3 kids. He lived in a nice house. Went to church on Sundays. Played the role of family man. Meanwhile, he was sneaking off to motel rooms with my wife. The more I thought about it, the more a fire built in my chest. It wasn't enough for Jenny to be exposed. Bob needed to pay too. I asked Ron for more, everything he could dig up on Bob, and Ron delivered again. Turns out Bob's wife, Sarah, was exactly the kind of woman Jenny had mocked in her emails. Devoted, worn thin from motherhood, but still doing everything she could to keep her family together. I looked at her picture in the report and felt this overwhelming wave of sympathy. She didn't deserve this any more than I did. She needed to know. So I made a plan. I had Harold draw up the divorce papers, timed so they'd be served to Jenny at her workplace. I wanted her to feel the sting of public humiliation, just once, the way she'd humiliated me in secret for months. And at the same time, Ron would deliver the report to Sarah, 2 bombs dropping at once, one to end my marriage, one to set fire to Bob's. The morning it happened, I felt strangely calm, like I was walking into a storm I'd been preparing for my whole life. My phone buzzed just after lunch. It was Ron. She knows, he said simply, and that was the moment everything shifted, not just for me, but for everyone involved. The day after the divorce papers were served, our world fell apart in ways I never imagined. Not with a bang, not with dramatic screaming matches in the street, but with quiet, simmering chaos. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that morning, coffee gone cold in my mug, staring at the empty space where Jenny used to sit. The kids were at school, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the walls of our suburban house. I wanted to cry, scream, throw things, but all I could do was breathe. One slow, measured breath after another. Jenny didn't call me that day, and that silence was worse than any argument we'd ever had. I knew she'd been served. I knew she had seen the papers, but still, I waited, gripping the edge of the table, feeling the weight of months of betrayal pressing down on my chest. When she finally came home, her face was pale, her lips tight. She tried to act normal, tried to brush it off, but I could see it. The fear, the panic, the realization that her little secret had exploded in her face. I didn't speak. I just watched. For once, I didn't need to argue or defend myself. The truth had already spoken, louder than anything either of us could say, and in that silence, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Relief that I finally had clarity, emptiness that the life I thought I had built, the life I thought was stable, was gone. Meanwhile, Ron was doing his part quietly, delivering the report to Sarah. I didn't know the details at first. All I had were his texts. She knows, she's taking action. And then the legal documents started rolling in. A flood of court papers, restraining orders, eviction notice. Bob's carefully curated life began to crumble in ways I hadn't even imagined. His wife cleaned out their joint account, taking the kids and moving out immediately. The house, owned by her father, was no longer his. Job at the family business evaporated the moment word got back to his father-in-law. I watched it all unfold from a distance, because at that point, I didn't want to be the villain. I wasn't seeking vengeance directly, just letting the truth do its work. But still, the satisfaction was undeniable. Bob had underestimated the consequences of his actions. He had assumed he could continue his double life without anyone noticing, without anyone caring. But life has a way of catching up with people, and it caught up with him hard. Back at home, my own world was in turmoil. The kids were confused, scared, and angry in ways they couldn't articulate. My 6-year-old son asked me why mommy wasn't at dinner one night, and I had to invent some excuse about her being busy at work. My daughter cried herself to sleep, asking if we would all be okay, if mommy still loved us, if we were the reason she left. It was heartbreaking, the way children try to make sense of adult chaos. I held them close, telling them everything would be okay, all the while wondering if it really would be. I took time off work, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, but the grief was relentless. I felt betrayed not just by Jenny, but by the illusion of family I had clung to, by the dreams I thought were ours, by the quiet life I had been promised. I couldn't stop replaying memories, our wedding day, birthdays, the first time I held each of the kids in my arms. All of it felt tainted now, as if someone had smeared ink across my entire history. Even friends and family were affected. People whispered, some took sides, some offered condolences, others offered judgment. I felt isolated, though not completely. My parents, flawed as they were, tried to give advice, but it all sounded hollow. He's just like us, they said. Everyone makes mistakes, but this wasn't a mistake. This was calculated. This was betrayal with intention, and the sting was sharp enough to leave permanent scars. As Bob's life collapsed, the intensity of my emotions became almost unbearable. I didn't want him to suffer, at least not initially, but as the days turned into weeks, as I saw the chain reaction unfold, kids pulled away, a job lost, a house repossessed, criminal charges piling up, it became hard not to feel a sense of grim satisfaction. I reminded myself that it wasn't me orchestrating it directly, but still, the thought that he was finally feeling the weight of what he had done brought me a strange, bitter comfort. I also had to face Jenny directly in court, in the context of the divorce. It was cold, procedural, but necessary. Our interactions were limited to discussions about the kids, custody arrangements, and finances. Every word, every glance carried a history that neither of us could erase. She tried to negotiate, tried to minimize her losses, but the evidence was overwhelming. She had no leg to stand on, and I was merciful enough to accept the divorce without making it uglier than it needed to be. My focus was always the children, not revenge against her. Through it all, I discovered something about myself. I realized that I could survive more than I had ever imagined. I realized that heartbreak could coexist with clarity, betrayal could coexist with growth. I discovered a resilience I didn't know I had, a calm in the storm that allowed me to navigate not just the practicalities of the situation, but the emotional chaos as well. The fallout lasted for months. Nights were sleepless, days were exhausting. I found myself walking around the neighborhood late at night, just to clear my head. I listened to music that reminded me of happier times, flipping between Coldplay, Matchbox 20, and old Pearl Jam records, searching for some anchor in the storm. I thought about my kids constantly, thinking about the values I wanted to instill, about the kind of man I wanted to be for them, even as the foundation of my family was crumbling. By the time the legal proceedings were over, Bob had lost almost everything: job, house, marriage, dignity. Jenny was left with a fractured life and a tarnished reputation, and me, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, but strangely free. The weight of suspicion, uncertainty, and betrayal had been lifted. I had clarity now, and though it came at a cost, I knew I could finally begin to rebuild. It wasn't immediate,
and it wasn't easy. The kids needed constant reassurance, friends and family needed time to process, and I, more than anyone, needed to confront the raw, aching reality that the life I thought I had was gone. But somewhere in that pain, I found a strange sense of empowerment. I hadn't just survived betrayal, I had navigated it, and I had come out the other side.
After the initial storm of the fallout, there came a strange calm, a pause that felt almost unnatural. I remember one morning sitting on the front steps of the house, coffee in hand, watching the kids play on the lawn and realizing something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I had a chance to rebuild. Not just the house, not just the kids' routines, but me. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to Jenny's betrayal or Bob's recklessness. I was acting for myself. It started small. I cleaned the garage, organized the attic, and finally tackled the chaos that had been piling up while my life was imploding. There was something cathartic about it. As I sorted through old boxes and childhood memorabilia, I thought about the past, about how much I had inherited from my parents' dysfunction, and I realized that this time I had a choice. I didn't have to repeat the cycle. I didn't have to let betrayal define me. But the fire of anger hadn't completely died. Not yet. I couldn't forget what Bob had done, not just to me, but to his own family, to the life he had sworn to protect. I spent hours staring at the evidence, the photos, the email. At first, I justified the satisfaction I felt at his downfall as justice, a balancing of scales. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I confronted the darker truth. Part of me had wanted to orchestrate it all. Part of me had felt a dangerous thrill in watching his life crumble. It was moral chaos, and I wrestled with it constantly. Could I really celebrate someone else's destruction, even if he had caused me so much pain? I knew the answer wasn't simple, but what I could control was my own life, and so I shifted my focus. I started planning, thinking strategically, not about revenge, but about reclamation. First, I set boundaries. I made it clear to Jenny that any interaction would be strictly about the kids. No past, no blame, no lingering resentment in conversation. I wanted her to understand that I wasn't a pushover, but I also didn't want to poison my children with my anger. Every time she called, every time she texted, I reminded myself, this isn't about punishment anymore. It's about protection. Next, I focused on my career. I threw myself into work with an intensity I hadn't felt since my early 20s. The hours were long, and the stress was high, but I started to see results. My sales numbers went up. I earned the respect of colleagues, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, I realized that success wasn't just measured in money or job titles. It was measured in control, stability, and the ability to move forward without being defined by past wounds. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Bob, not obsessively, but enough to understand the consequences of his action. Public court documents, news clippings, and mutual acquaintances painted the picture clearly. His wife had moved on, his children were adjusting, and his professional reputation was in tatters. There were stories of him showing up at his ex-wife's new job to argue, of police reports, restraining orders, a broken nose, every detail added to a growing mosaic of accountability. It wasn't me who destroyed his life. It was the truth and the choices he had made. And in that, I found a measure of peace. But peace didn't mean complacency. I also wanted to make sure my kids grew up in a world where betrayal didn't define their reality. I enrolled them in extra activities, taught them responsibility, and tried to instill empathy and integrity in ways that I hadn't learned myself as a child. There were moments of guilt, of doubt, but every time I saw them laughing, safe and thriving, I reminded myself why I had fought so hard, not for revenge, but for them. Socially, I became more selective. Friends who were toxic or judgmental drifted away. Those who were supportive I discovered a sense of community I hadn't realized was missing. People who didn't know my past, but helped me shape my present. It was humbling, but necessary. I couldn't rebuild my life while clinging to resentment and old wounds. There were nights, though, when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, revisiting every step of the chaos. The moral ambiguity of what had happened haunted me. Could I have handled things differently? Could I have confronted Jenny directly without involving Sarah? Could I have found a way to salvage the marriage instead of letting it explode? But each time I reminded myself that the betrayal was not my fault, and that I had done everything I could to protect the people who mattered most, my children. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started to forgive, not Jenny, not Bob, not even the past I had inherited from my parents, but myself. I forgave myself for the anger, for the obsession, for the nights of self-doubt. I forgave myself for the way I had let life spiral into chaos, because in that forgiveness, I discovered the first threads of freedom. By the time the dust had settled, I was no longer just a man who had been wronged. I was a man who had survived. I had navigated betrayal, exposure, and the unraveling of two other people's lives without losing myself entirely. And while I knew I would never forget, I also knew I could finally move forward with clarity, purpose, and resilience. Years have a strange way of smoothing edges, though they never completely erase scars. It's been nearly 2 decades since that storm of betrayal hit my life, and in that time, I've come to realize that surviving it wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about learning to live again. The kids are grown now, young adults navigating their own lives, and I'm proud of them in ways words can't capture. My son just started his first year of college in Ohio studying computer science, while my daughter works in digital marketing in Cleveland. Watching them flourish, hearing about their successes and setbacks, I feel a sense of fulfillment that has nothing to do with my ex-wife or Bob. They are my legacy, proof that love, patience, and guidance can survive even the darkest chapter. I haven't spoken to Jenny in years, except when absolutely necessary for paperwork related to the kids' futures. Our conversations are short, polite, devoid of any real connection. I don't hate her, not anymore, but I don't trust her either. She exists in my life solely as the mother of my children, nothing more. That detachment, that clear boundary, has brought me a sense of calm I didn't know I could feel. It's strange to think about the person I loved once, the life I imagined, and realize how fragile it all was. As for Bob, I don't know exactly where he is. Last I heard, he left the state entirely, his career in ruins, his family gone, and his reputation shattered. I sometimes wonder if he thinks about those choices, if he regrets them, if he's rebuilt anything resembling a normal life. Part of me doesn't care, and part of me hopes he's learned a lesson the hard way. Life has a way of catching up with people in its own time, and I've seen firsthand that truth has a power far greater than any anger or scheme I could ever muster. For me, the biggest lesson has been about resilience and perspective. Betrayal doesn't have to define you, and revenge, while tempting, is rarely satisfying in the long run. True power lies in surviving, in growing, in refusing to let someone else's choices dictate your future. I've learned to savor the small victories, the quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, the laughter of my kids, the satisfaction of work done well. I've learned to trust myself again, to build relationships rooted in honesty and integrity, and to protect my heart while still allowing it to feel. Looking back, I see the moments of foreshadowing that I ignored for too long, the little trips to her parents, the extra miles on the car, the subtle changes in behavior. I see how my own upbringing, the scars from my parents' betrayals, shaped my response, both good and bad. And I see how far I've come from a man consumed by suspicion and rage to someone capable of reflection, understanding, and even forgiveness. Not forgiveness for what they did, but for myself, for allowing life to continue, despite the pain. There are nights when I still catch myself drifting back, remembering the sticky note on the computer, the emails, the motel photos. I relive the anger and the heartbreak, but now it's accompanied by gratitude, grateful that I made it through, that my kids were protected, that I could act without losing myself completely. I've come to understand that betrayal, as painful as it is, can also be a catalyst. It can teach, it can reveal character, it can illuminate paths we never knew existed. I've rebuilt a life that's quieter than it was, but stronger. I've built boundaries, nurtured my relationships with my children, and forged a career and social circle that reflect who I am, rather than who I once was. The anger is still there, sometimes like an echo in the background, but it no longer controls me. It's just a reminder, a memory of what I survived, and a testament to the strength I found along the way. So that's the story, in all its messy, painful, human detail: betrayal, exposure, revenge, fallout, and finally, survival. I don't tell it for pity, or for applause, or even for judgment. I tell it because life doesn't pause, and sometimes you have to navigate the worst chapters without losing your sense of self. I tell it because the truth, no matter how ugly, has a way of freeing you if you let it. And as I sit here now, with 2 grown children, a stable life, and the quiet assurance that I can face whatever comes next, I realize something I never thought I would. Pain is temporary, but resilience, self-respect, and love for yourself, and for those who matter, last a lifetime. That's the final lesson I carry, tucked into the quiet corners of my life, like a candle that survived a storm and still burns.